So welcome everyone. My name is Mary Kate Kelly, and today's webinar is called Living Well After a Cancer Diagnosis, and it's part of Cancer Care West's webinar series. If I can ask everybody just to mute their microphones, that would be great. Thank you so much. So today's webinar is part of Cancer Care's webinar series, a part of Living with Uncertainty. And it's also for World Cancer Day, which is happening on the 4th of February this year. As I said, my name is Mary Kate Kelly, and I work as a counsellor psychotherapist in Cancer Care West in the support centre in Galway. We also have a support centre in Donegal, where Patricia Doherty is, who's providing us with the wonderful backup for IT and admin. So thank you so much, Patricia, for all the support. My colleague who will also be presenting today is Dr. Katie Barrett, and she is a clinical psychologist who works alongside me in the support centre in Galway. The webinar, as I said, is being recorded today. So again, if the microphones can be muted, and feel free to turn off your camera so you can fully relax. The topics that we're going to cover today, my topic will be looking at some of the impacts of a cancer diagnosis and what they might look like for you, as well as living well in ways that work for you. Katie will be looking at a model called acceptance and commitment therapy and how that can be used with strategies that support well-being. And then at the very end, there will be a time where the recording will be stopped and a time for questions and answers and any discussions that might have come up for you during that. Yes, the recording will be available later, Wendy. And Patricia, if you could put on the slide 1 for me. I don't seem to be able to do that. I'm not sure. There we go. So, as I said, the impact of a cancer diagnosis can hit different people in different ways over time. So everything that I'm talking about, some things may apply to you and some things may not. We're all unique. And then I'll explore ways of what living well might look like for you. Looking at elements like physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. And remember, this can also change over time. Oh, thanks, Patricia. So some of the impacts of a cancer diagnosis. The number of cancer survivors in Ireland is currently estimated at 4% of the population. And this is predicted to double by the year 2045. So that's an awful lot of people being impacted by this experience. And remember, cancer is also one word that's used to describe over 100 different diseases. And each person being unique with their own life story and circumstances before this happened, your life before anything happened to do with this, and how that impacts you on that is going to be very particular and unique to you. The diagnosis experience itself, what was that like for you? Was it a complete surprise, a bolt out of the blue? Or maybe it was expected, maybe it was something you've been worried about for quite a long time. Did you feel that it was handled quite well, that the communication was good, that your connection with the people that you were dealing with was quite good? Or maybe you didn't feel it was handled very well for you. Maybe it felt quite stressful and confusing. Maybe it wasn't even your first diagnosis experience, and maybe it brought back memories of other diagnosis experiences. All of these things matter in how this is going to land with you in that moment. The treatment experience itself can be really varied. Stacey in 1997 describes how radiotherapy destroys as it heals, chemotherapy pollutes as it cleanses. Modern cancer treatments all impact the body, and it can sometimes feel like the body is being poisoned or hurt with the hope of recovery or management. So how was your treatment experience? Did it feel straightforward, difficult, distressing, boring, lonely, confusing? All of those things at once at times. And again, this can shape how you feel afterwards, that experience of treatment. And then when treatment does end, many people can feel really unsettled or surprised, something they were looking forward to. And it can feel like a cliff edge, or like they're suddenly out the back of a building unexpectedly. And the diary starts to look empty. And there can be a sense of, well, now what happens? Maybe the text messages asking how you're doing start to dry up, and it can leave you feeling a little bit lost. Or maybe your treatment doesn't end. Maybe there's an element of your treatment that's ongoing, and how that impacts your life on a day-to-day basis, especially if everyone else is acting like it's all done now as far as they're concerned. but maybe it's not all done for you. So if you could go forward one slide for me, Patricia. Thank you. Thank you. So this quote from Nancy Storedall I quite like, because she's talking about this idea of being a survivor. And just back one, Patricia, please. Thank you. She says, I guess I am now officially a survivor. I have no idea what the hell this means. I do not feel like one. And regardless, for whatever reason, this situation has been assigned to me and there's no turning back. And I like that quote because it says a lot to me about how the word survivor is what you're going to see in a lot of the leaflets and literatures and websites. But for some people, it doesn't sit very well. Many people can't even agree a definition of what that means. So even the language can be difficult throughout this, but it will be the word that you'll come across quite regularly, and that can be frustrating. So we can go on to the next slide, Patricia, please. Thank you. So if we move on to the idea of feelings, one feeling that comes up a lot for people after a cancer diagnosis is loss. Anne Boyer talks about after a cancer diagnosis, very little is ever itself again. And there are many losses to be navigated and processed with this experience. There might be a loss of identity as a healthy person, a loss of roles in your life, maybe even being a carer. There could even be a loss of hope if it's a diagnosis of recurrence, loss of energy if you're left with fatigue because of treatments, loss of body image because of changes to your body, how your body looks, or scars. Cognitive changes, some people call chemo brain or brain fog, and that can be really challenging for some people. Financial losses, if you've got job-related losses where it's changing your ability to work full-time, maybe you're having to switch part-time, or even having to change your work altogether. There can even be relationship losses where friends who you thought would be there for you suddenly disappear, take a step back, and are nowhere to be found. Acquaintances can step forwards, but real losses around relationships or intimacy loss. And these are all very real losses that have to be navigated and worked through. Worden talks about that when cancer causes loss, loss results in grief, and grief requires mourning. And this can be a part of the experience that other people don't always understand. So we can go to the next slide, Patricia, please. Another feeling can be one of isolation. Arthur Frank talks about the gap between what I feel and what I feel allowed to say widens and swallows my voice. The messages in Western culture around how we are supposed to feel when it comes to cancer can be very loud indeed. And when we can't talk about our experience that we're going through in a way that makes sense to us, that can leave us feeling very isolated and alone. And this can happen for many people, even if they're surrounded by people who love and care for them. But if they don't feel able to speak about how they're feeling and what they're going through, then feelings of isolation and loneliness can follow. And so the next slide, please, Patricia. Thank you. Another feeling that's completely normal to feel is fear and worry. Susie Hosman talks about, I'm not a better person as a result of cancer. I'm unattractively hypochondriacal. Cancer wasn't my epiphany. It was painful and lonely. I'm the other cancer story and I'm still alive. It's completely normal to feel more vulnerable after a cancer diagnosis and treatment. And it's okay if you're not worried and afraid. Any feeling's okay. But to feel bad about having a feeling adds to the pressure. And hearing people that you say all the time that you have to be positive can increase that pressure if that's not how you're feeling that day. Dr. Jimmy Holland describes this as the tyranny of positive thinking. And it really surrounds cancer in our culture in a very strong way. And it's important to know that it's okay to feel how you're feeling. So thanks, Patricia. So if we move on to language as an idea, that words really matter and they can have a big impact when it comes to the cancer experience. So how do you feel about some of the words on this slide? Survivor, victim, patient, thriver, fighter, warrior, hero, inspiration, living with cancer. Be positive, and usually there's an implied exclamation mark after that one, or fight and battle language. Maybe some fit well. If you go back there, Patricia, for me. Right. There you go, thank you. Maybe some of these words fit well with you, and if they do, that's great. But if they don't, that's also okay. The words that you like to use can also change over time, and that's allowed. At one point, you might feel that survivor fits, and at another time, maybe patient fits. You're allowed to change your word to fit how you're feeling. And it's okay not to use words just because other people like them and other people are using them. Thank you, Patricia. Another part of stories, our language, is the stories that we tell ourselves. The dominant stories in our culture around cancer are triumph or tragedy. And they're usually told by people who never have had a diagnosis themselves. It's like happy ever after, treatment's done, you're all good now, and you're skipping through life. Or it's, oh dear, that's a bit tragic. And it would almost be like if we watched Disney movies like Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty and thought that they were accurate representations of what it was to date and have a relationship. We know that it's not. We know that those are two-dimensional stories. And a lot of the stories that you will see in the media, online, magazines, radio that surround cancer are very two-dimensional, are very triumph or tragedy, because that sells paper, it gets the clicks, and it's easier to tell, it's less complicated, because people's lives are complicated, and sometimes our stories are messy and disrupted. Because a cancer diagnosis does disrupt your life story. It changes how things were going along. And then noticing what those disruptions are can be important for you. And then the idea of coherent stories is how to begin to rewrite your life story in a way that makes sense to you, that includes this event, doesn't exclude it, doesn't try to pretend that it's triumph and tragedy, but that creates a story that's yours and that it feels coherent and makes sense to you. Thanks, Patricia. And that moves on to that idea of meaning and making sense of what has happened. Judy Siegel described how cancer threw me high up in the air and tossed me around vigorously. I was put down on the ground again, only not exactly in the same place. And making sense of this experience is a very personal process for you, and only you can make sense of this for you. Some people view cancer happening to them as random, as bad luck, or because of something that they did, maybe even as a punishment or a learning or a gift. Those are very different meanings to carry through life. And sometimes we can carry a few of those all at the same time. They can also change over time. And what sense you make around what has happened to you is part of reconnecting to yourself again in the here and now of today. And it's something that only you can do for yourself, because accepting other people's meanings sometimes can feel a little bit too easy, and sometimes they don't fit over time. So this process of making sense for you is important. And then we come to the idea of trauma. And I like this image because there's that little island and the person's there in the middle thinking, no, cancer surgery worked. And then there's we know to expect the impact of the treatment if you're going through chemotherapy and radiotherapy. And sometimes people can see the healing outside bit, but rarely do they expect the height of the healing inside and how long that can take. And both a cancer diagnosis and treatments, they both carry the potential for trauma. It doesn't mean that everybody's traumatized by it, but there's the potential for trauma. And this can take time and sometimes takes professional support for some people to work through. And that's part of what Cancer Care West offers. And after a traumatic experience, we often hear about resilience as an idea that people are more resilient after a trauma. And the important thing to remember about resilience is resilience includes having new strengths, for sure, but it also includes having new vulnerabilities. And sometimes we can overlook the vulnerability bit and how long it takes to just process this experience. So the idea of living well with uncertainty, Musa Mayer puts it well for me when she says, the truth is that no one is certain of anything. Being a cancer patient shoves that truth in your face. A fear of recurrence can be a big element of living with uncertainty for many people. And the webinar that happened in November was about that topic specifically. And I would highly encourage you to look at that recording if you have any concerns around fears of recurrence, which is a very common thing for people to carry after a cancer diagnosis. And the recording link can be emailed to you. But often what can happen when we consider the future and our relationship for the future can be completely changed. We can engage in almost like a fearful fortune telling. And that's to do with how our brain is wired. Our brain likes to look out for threat. So that makes sense. It's just part of how we are as a species. Dr. David Spiegel says that while life can pretty much get back to normal, and for some people it does, for some people not as much, it will never be the same. You've been diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. You've come face to face with a vulnerability that we would all like to ignore. You can't quite feel as insulated from danger as you did before. So we can be looking to the future like that woman on the right to the doors and quickly notice the black door and the purple door. And there could be all these other doors that we actually ignore because we're so focused on the worries and the fears. And it's almost like learning how to see all the possibilities in the future. Because if we're uncertain, if we don't know what the future holds, uncertainty can become a sort of friend, because we can remind ourselves, well, if we don't know, then we don't know. And the future might also hold good stuff. But that can almost be something that we have to teach ourselves to remember, that there may be fearful things, but there may also be good things that we don't know yet. Thanks, Patricia. So this slide for me is something for you all to hold in your mind, that there are aspects of experience that we all have, but this might be a useful one to remember. Our body, heart, mind, and spirit, they're all impacted by this experience. And it's how you can find ways to live well with your body, physically, minding yourself, your heart and your emotions, your mind, how's my thinking? What are my thoughts doing? And your spirit, and that could be your faith or your values, how you like to approach life. And that's a good one to hold in mind as you're considering how to live well in the here and now. And I really like this particular cartoon because sometimes people ask, when is it over? And that's a really hard one to answer. And this cartoon's full of all these little moments where people are being reminded actually over and over again about cancer. It's hard to escape in our modern world. And there can be many reasons. It can be scan appointments, it can be tests, it can be letters coming in, it could be recurrences or fear of recurrences, hearing about somebody else getting a diagnosis, living with metastases yourself. The important thing is you don't have to wait for it to be over, whatever that means, to live well in the here and now. And that's an important thing to remember. It's also okay to have good days and bad days, just like everybody else has. Because before this happened, you had good days and bad days. If you could go back one there for me, Patricia, that'd be great. Thank you. And it's something about reminding yourself that you're also allowed to have the good days and bad days. Have the good moments, have the crack, have the fun. And then if suddenly you're feeling stressed and worried, that's okay. That's part of being in the here and now. And to give yourself permission to have that and to have the full range of emotions. So the next slide, Patricia, please, is toxic positivity bingo. So if you look through all those statements, I would be surprised if you hadn't had one or several of those statements offered to you, maybe with the best of intentions, but over time that can feel a bit relentless. If you're somehow expected to be this poster child, having been put through treatment, and maybe you're feeling tired or worried about something, nobody can be positive all the time. That's not a realistic aspiration. But people can almost learn these phrases and offer them to you thinking that they're being helpful, but actually being on the receiving end of lots of these can feel exhausting and isolating. What I think is a little bit more helpful is the idea that all feelings are allowed. We can have an idea, like the one on the left there, of how I thought I might feel after surviving cancer, happy, fearless, and grateful. But in reality, there are way more feelings that can turn up all at once or over several hours or days. And all feelings are allowed and are welcome because it's part of who we are. And usually if a feeling turns up, there's a reason. And if feelings become overwhelming, or you're feeling that actually you can't cope with how you're feeling, that's where professional support can be helpful. Or you can obviously talk to family and friends, but for some people, they find it easier and more useful to come and speak to a professional. And that can be part of your plan of living well in the here and now as well. So this particular slide I thought was useful because our brain has continually got all these hormones running around, and there are activities that we do that can help stimulate them. So for dopamine, that's our reward chemical. Eating food, unsurprisingly, which is part of why we enjoy our food so much, in general, stimulates dopamine. Achieving a goal, completing a task, self-care activities. Endorphins are the pain-killing. So we get that with exercise, listening to music we love, watching a movie, or laughter. Oxytocin is called the love hormone. We get that through socializing, physical touch with people we trust, petting animals, or helping others. And then, of course, serotonin can stabilize our mood. Sun exposure, mindfulness, being in nature, and meditation. These are all things that we can weave into our lives and do with the intention of supporting the physical side, because, of course, the physical feeds into the mental, feeds into the emotional, and feeds into the spiritual, all joined in together. So finally, to me, it's all about finding your way of living well. And that's going to look different from the next person, because you're different from the next person, and what you've lived through is different from the next person. Judy Siegel talks about the stories we might tell of the experience, if we do wish to tell a story at all, do need to be honoured, even if they are, and especially if they are, the ones that no one really expected to hear. So if you feel in your life that the people around you can't hear the story that you're needing to tell about what you've gone through, then that's where sometimes accessing professional support can be helpful. You may find that actually people can hear your story and are wanting to hear your story, and that can be really important. Holland and Lewis remind us that there is no generic one-size-fits-all coping style for dealing with cancer, and I think that's really important to remember. You're a unique human being who's gone through your experience, and you're allowed to cope with this and find a way to live well in a way that is yours, and tailor that as it changes over time, and give yourself permission to do that. And hopefully some of the things that I've spoken about today will give you some pointers. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Katie, and she will talk all about some really interesting things as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mary-Kate. So I think the bit that I'm going to try and speak to is this model called acceptance and commitment therapy, because some of it will be similar to what Mary-Kate has just spoken about, opening up to our feelings and being in the present moment. But really the focus of this section will be doing those things so that we can do what matters. So often, especially in an experience of cancer, there are so many things that are outside of your control. And one of them is actually what's happening inside you. So those thoughts and feelings that we can't choose not to be worried, or you can't choose not to be sad. But sometimes if we're able to open up and be flexible and be gentle with our thoughts and feelings and what's happening inside us, that gives us a bit more freedom to do what matters. And that's what we're really talking about today, is doing what matters to you so that you can live well, whatever that means to you, to kind of echo what Mary-Kate's been saying. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these things: open up, be present, and do what matters. But I'm also going to hopefully give an exercise. So if people had a sheet of paper to hand, it might be useful, but it's not a necessity. You can also just sit back and kind of let it happen. But it might be helpful even if there's just some things you'd like to set goals around, or things that you'd like to explore for yourself as I'm talking. But whatever is going to be useful for you. Okay. I might go on to the next slide if that's okay. Thanks, Patricia. So the first pillar of this model is open up. And it's a lot of what Mary-Kate would have just been speaking about, in that all of the emotions that you're going to experience as a consequence of the cancer diagnosis are actually pretty normal and natural reactions to a very abnormal situation. So whether it's that loneliness or fear or anxiety or sadness, they would all be expected. And there is often that message that you need to be positive, or you need to be grateful, or at least it's not this, at least it's that. And often by getting those messages, it kind of dismisses your very real and valid experiences. So Sometimes when those negative emotions come up, what we perceive as being negative emotions, like sadness or guilt or stress or worry or anger, they're pretty uncomfortable to be with. By and large, people don't like to experience those emotions. So the tendency is for ourselves and other people, try and find a way to get rid of those feelings. And it might be by telling you to be positive or not think about it. But actually by doing these things, often we can increase our struggle and increase our contact with that emotion, because all of a sudden we not only have the sadness to contend with, but also the guilt for feeling sad because other people don't want us to feel sad, or where we might feel anxiety and other people can say, don't worry about that. You might then feel ashamed for feeling anxious. So it can make things a lot harder in the long term if we're kind of trying to find a way to get rid of or fix or solve these normal and natural emotions. So the alternative might be to treat yourself with compassion when those feelings show up. Just acknowledge them and allow them for what they are, which is normal and natural. And focus on doing that, being with them and being flexible with them, so that we don't spend all of our time struggling to get rid of them. And that might actually free us up to do more of what matters to us. So I thought this image is helpful in trying to capture that kind of thought. So often when those difficult feelings show up, the way I think of this image is nearly like if you were floating in a swimming pool and there's a beach ball floating around, and every time it gets close to you, it kind of bothers you. You don't want it to be around. You'd rather it wasn't there at all. And so you might push it underwater, trying to say, okay, if I just suppress it and get rid of it, then I won't have to deal with it. But as time goes on, actually, well, first of all, it's exhausting to have to do that. It takes a lot of your focus and energy to work on looking like it's not there or trying to keep it at bay. And often it can pop up and smack you in the face at a time you're least expecting it, which is what can happen when we kind of disavow or avoid our emotions as well. So it's not that you have to like these feelings or want them to be there or allow them to kind of take over, but it's more about allowing them to show up as they are without feeling guilty or adding extra blame or shame on top of it, so that you can just acknowledge them and reach out for support if you need to. But really it frees up that space so that you're not spending all your time focusing on avoiding or suppressing. Instead, you can choose to focus on doing what matters to you. So the next pillar, kind of following on from that, would be about being present. So if we're talking about our emotions and being opening up to them and allowing them to be there, it's also important to talk about our minds, a bit like Mary Kate would have acknowledged that often in times of stress, our minds, because they're problem-solving machines, they like certainties and they like to think about the future, maybe the worst case scenario, the most catastrophic outcome, so that we can then work backwards and think, how do we prevent that from happening? Or else think about the past and what we could have done in the past that would have changed things or made things better, or why we did things wrong. And it's doing those things to try and look for answers so that we get more information so that we can do better. So the intention is good. But often if we get hooked by these thoughts, we can feel very blamed and criticized by ourselves that we didn't do enough, or that we should have known better, or else we can get really like that, kind of distracted by the future that we don't necessarily have any certainty about, feeling like our mind's going, this is guaranteed to happen, how do I take all these steps to prevent it? And again, our minds like those certainties and like black and white answers, so it will constantly try and do that to us. So one thing that can help is seeing if there's any way to kind of unhook from our minds when they're doing that, and only engaging with it in a way that's useful to us, rather than believing all of these criticisms or blames, or getting caught up in the anxiety or the difficult things from the past. Because believing those things and getting caught up with them does have an impact emotionally as well. And we can feel quite stuck sometimes if we're believing judgments or anxieties. So this model really is, instead of trying to control or get rid of those thoughts, it's trying to see if we can change our relationship with them, so that they don't have as much power over us. So I'll talk a little bit about a few strategies that can help with that. But I liked this image because it's a nice description of what can happen sometimes when our minds are in that mode, when we're either giving ourselves a feeling of being a failure, judging ourselves, telling us stories again about this is who I was and this is who I am now and why this is worse than that. Or again, traveling into the future or the past. And when we believe all those messages that our minds are saying to us, even though the mind is really just trying to protect us, trying to prepare us, it can leave us feeling quite stuck, because then we might feel like there's nothing I can do because this is true. Whereas if we can kind of gently unhook and release ourselves from believing all of these stories that our minds are telling us, it gives us that bit more freedom to actually choose what we want to do, what's important to us. And again, that depends on the individual, because different things are going to matter to everyone else. But that's the reason we choose to try and unhook from our minds. So some things that can be helpful are even just noticing. So like that, trying to observe when you're having a thought or a judgment and see if you can kind of externalize it a little bit. So just say, I'm just noticing that I'm judging myself right now, or I'm noticing that my mind is really caught up in the future at this moment. Because if you notice that, then it gives you an opportunity to do something different, or to step away from it and come back to the here and now, if that's helpful. Or mental appreciation. So when you notice that your mind is kind of chiming in with worries or opinions or criticisms, try and like that, acknowledge its intention, which is usually good. Like, you're doing a great job trying to keep me safe today. Thanks for worrying about that. I really appreciate it. And I don't think it's helping me in this moment. So it's not that the thought's going to stop, but it means that you get a bit of space to kind of say, oh, I don't need to engage with that if it's not serving me. There's also the treating the mind as an external, like it's another person. So if you're imagining that you were sitting down with your mind and it was saying, you're useless, you're making mistakes all the time, or you should have done that better, or you should have known better. If that was someone sitting down with you in that moment, would you choose to listen to them? Would you be thinking, that's a nice person that I want to spend time with? Or would you be kind of going, oh God, they're always giving out, but not take what they're saying so literally? So even if there's a way to kind of acknowledge that there goes my mind, and my mind is worrying again, or my mind is criticizing again, but not allowing it to kind of seep into your sense of yourself, then sometimes that's a helpful strategy. One that I like is the pop-up mind. So imagining that negative chatter that happens in your head can be like internet pop-up ads. So, you might click into a site, and then all of a sudden you start getting all of these messages up. And most of the time you're going, no, 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 not relevant, not for me. And then every now and then you might say, oh, that's something nice, actually. I didn't know that existed. Maybe I'll order that for a friend. But most of the time, they're not going to be useful to you. And our minds are like that. They just churn out content because that's what they're designed to do. They're designed to problem solve and to think. But that doesn't mean that everyone is a winner, just like those pop-up ads. So you can kind of choose to notice the ones that are unhelpful and to not engage with them if they don't serve you. So equally, probably said that in a few of those examples anyway. But the other skill might be asking yourself, what is that in service of? When you have thoughts that are coming in and they're getting really caught up in them, sometimes you might end up kind of ruminating on certain things. Just asking yourself, what is this in service of? What is this thought doing for me? Because sometimes there's a really good reason. You might say, well, I need to plan this, or I need to think about this, I need to resolve this, have this sorted, have options. And that can be really practical. And then it's serving you. And other times you might say, well, actually, this is only keeping me stuck here and now. And actually, this is making me feel worse, or it's impacting my mood, or it's keeping me caught. And in that case, it's about just acknowledging, okay, so my mind is tripping me up right now, but maybe I can get back to doing what actually matters to me and not get so hooked by what our minds might be telling us. So those are just some ideas that can help you to kind of unhook from your mind, separate out from it if it's causing difficulties or giving judgments, criticisms. And the last part, I suppose, when we're talking about opening up and being present to both our thoughts and our feelings, we're really doing that so that we have some flexibility and some space to make choices so that we can do what matters to us. We're not doing it because we like saying, oh, well, I love sadness, so I'm going to spend more time with sadness, but more because if we struggle with it, then we end up getting caught in the struggle rather than focusing on doing the things that we actually do have power over, which is our behavior, what we actually want to do on a day-to-day basis. So this bit is all about doing what matters. And to talk about that, I think it's really important to talk about our values. And I will ask some questions in a minute just to get people thinking about what your values actually are. But I think a useful concept for actually understanding values is this concept of a compass. That values are the things that are meaningful and important and precious to us in our lives. But they're not goals. They can't be achieved and they can't be ticked off a list. And we're also not picking them because we think, oh, my mother would really want me to say that now if I was saying that out loud. Picking them because they actually matter to us. So when we're thinking about values like a compass, imagine that I was saying, okay, the direction that's really important to me, the direction I really want to go is west. So the thing about going west is that I can keep going west and never actually hit west. It's never done. I've never achieved west. So I might get indications along the way that I'm moving that direction. Like I might, if I start in Dublin, I might say, okay, now I'm in Galway, it's definitely west. Now I'm in New York, now I'm in LA. And they're all signals that I'm on that valued path, but I'm never going to hit west. In the same way, our values are things that we strive to live by, but we can never actually achieve, like being a loving partner. So that Valentine's Day is coming up. So if values were like goals, we might say, oh yeah, I'll get someone a present on Valentine's Day and that makes me a loving partner, done. And I can treat them really badly for the rest of the year and it doesn't matter. But we all know that that wouldn't be true. You have to keep living like one and you have to keep doing it consistently in order to be moving in that direction. So that's one of the things that we'll be talking about, is those directions we want to move towards, because that's really about what living well is, moving towards the things that matter to you, which is going to be individual to you. And then you can set short, medium and long-term goals in line with your values. So I might kind of slow down here for a second and actually just give a minute to connecting to values. And again, no one needs to share anything. It can be just you thinking about the answers to these questions yourself. And there might be very similar answers to some of them, or they might be very different, or there might be conflicting ones because there might be two things that are in competition, and that's all fine. But maybe just starting by getting curious about, what do you want to do more of, less of, or differently in your life right now? Is there anything that you'd like to be moving towards, doing more of? Or what makes a good life to you? Knowing that everyone in this webinar right now might have a very different answer about what makes a good life. What's the most important thing to you right now? Again, thinking about those broad directions that you want to move in. Could be being a caring friend or an attentive colleague or consistent in my eating. Could be something really small or really big. What matters to you? Who do you care about in your life? What sort of person do you want to be, if you could choose? And how do you want to treat yourself, others, and the world around you? And maybe just taking a pause to actually look over some of the things if you've written them down, or think over them, because there might be common themes that you're going, yeah, actually that's really important to me. Or I didn't realize that was so important to me. And just making sure that these are these broad, unachievable things, like being a compassionate friend that you have to keep living by. You can't just tick it off and never have to do it again. Because, again, when we're talking about this model, the reason we want to open up to our emotions and not spend all our time struggling with them or forcing them away, or getting caught up in our thoughts and getting hooked and pulled away into doing things we might not necessarily want to do, is so that we can show up to the present moment, think about what's important here and now, and then do more of what's actually important to you. So that's how this model kind of ties together. But I have a little exercise again that I'm going to try and I have an example. It's a very broad example. It won't be applicable to everyone. So hopefully the exercise itself is broad enough that you can personalize it. But it's just an example of how we can think about moving more in the direction of the things that are important to us versus what it looks like when we're pulled away from the things that are important to us. And maybe setting some goals for yourself in line with that, because according to this model, that would be what makes a good life, is living in line with the things that are important to you. So the exercise is called the choice point. And if people have a piece of paper and they want to write it down as a memory, just as a memory aid so they can do it later themselves and they have more time, absolutely you can do that. But really the question is, when a difficult situation comes up, we're going to naturally have normal, difficult thoughts and feelings around that. And we don't get to control having those thoughts or feelings. They're going to come up by virtue of the situation being hard. But what we do get to choose about is how we respond to them, whether we let ourselves be hooked and taken away by those judgments and self-criticisms, or struggling with our emotions and trying not to feel them. And sometimes that means we end up quite disengaged from our values, and that might be moving away from what's important to us. Or else, if we can open up to them and treat ourselves kindly and think about what really matters to us in this moment and the direction we want to move towards, that will be a towards move. So the towards, in a way, are about values, moving towards or going further away from values. So an example of towards move might be, depending on the person, and again, I always say that your values might look very, very different to this. This is very broad. Being a caring and loving partner, parent, or friend, that I'd know I was moving towards the kind of life I want to live and the things that are important to me if I was maybe listening to my partner, or if I was in the shop and I saw a chocolate bar that I knew someone really liked, then I might pick it up for them. And those might be the small actions that are in line with moving towards that value of being a caring and loving partner or parent. Or it might be exploring my creativity. Could be connecting with nature. These are the things that you would want to be moving towards if you had free choice, and if the difficult thoughts and feelings weren't tripping you up. What direction do you want to move towards? Or engaging in something that challenges you mentally. That might be another one. Examples of away moves. If those were examples of towards moves for the same person, away moves might be being disengaged from the people I care about. So being kind of caught up in my own thoughts, or maybe just not being fully present when they're talking to me. Not doing any activities I enjoy, feeling like, oh, actually, my energy is quite low, so I won't bother doing that today, but then I end up feeling worse, or then I end up criticizing myself for not doing it. Spending more time scrolling my phone and tending to zone out, rather than doing something that challenges me and engages me. They're just some examples of what might look like away moves or towards moves. But it's also really important to know that at different times in treatment or after surgeries, spending time on your phone scrolling might be a towards move, because it might be saying, I'm allowing myself to recover. It might be saying, I'm taking the time to actually give my body a chance. So this is really personal. It's about, for you right now, what is a towards move? What's telling you that's the direction I want to go in? And what is an away move? Because again, we have to be flexible with these things. It's not about beating ourselves over the head. So an example might again be if it was time recovering at home after completing treatment, that might be the situation that's difficult. And a lot of difficult feelings and thoughts might come up around that for some people. And again, there's no right or wrong. This is just a theoretical example of what someone might feel. They might feel anger, that they're not able to do the things they would usually want to do, sadness, guilt, shame, thinking it'll never get better, or I'm so useless now, or this is the way I was before, my role has totally changed. And in that moment, it will be very natural and normal to feel those things and to maybe become more disengaged from the things and people you care about, or opt out of activities that you enjoy, or spend more time scrolling on your phone because your mind might be hooking you and telling you that there's no point, or what's the difference, it'll never get better, and pull you away. Whereas if you could choose what you're moving towards, you might still say, I want to be a present and loving parent, partner, be creative, do things that challenge me, or return to activities. And then it's about finding a way to unhook from the things that are pulling you away. whether it's beliefs about yourself or difficult feelings. And again, knowing that in the same context, sometimes people might just not be well enough to do those things, and that might actually be a towards move in recovery. So this isn't about blame. It's about just thinking through an example of what it might look like. So in general, when we're hooked and being pulled away from the things that matter to us, we might be believing negative thoughts about ourselves, thinking about the past or future, and not focusing on the present. We might be caught up in what's going to happen next or what's just gone. Not planning or setting goals around the things that are actually important to us as individuals. Whereas when we can unhook and kind of be gentle with those emotions that come up and recognize when our minds are tripping us up, it generally involves being kind and compassionate. So not believing those stories about ourselves or buying those thoughts. Focusing on this moment so that we get to make choices about what we actually do. So setting goals around the things that are important and doing this as much as we possibly can, according to the context and what we're able for in that moment. So that's the kind of whole model put together. So to help us unhook, we might need some of those skills like externalizing our mind or catching it, or being really gentle with our emotions. And then we can hopefully make choices in line with our values, moving towards the things that matter. So I don't know, do you want to add anything to any of that, Mary Kate? Because otherwise, we can just leave a portion at the end here for questions and answers, and knowing that there's a lot of talking and that there might be lots of things that will come up for people that they have questions about, and we can stop the recording just so that people know as well that it won't be registered on the recording.
Yeah, I don't think I could add much, Katie. I think I really like that model. I think it's really useful.